jazz we talked about that we can make, and we're gonna have a lot of fun doing that. So thank you. So thank you everyone for joining,
Jazz we
across all
talked about
this.
that.
And we're gonna jump right into it here and find another beautiful question together. So let's go on that adventure. I'm really excited every time because I get to learn, you guys get to learn, and our guests generally have a fun experience where we go through, let's call it a gauntlet of difficult questions. However, most things that are truly rewarding in life are difficult to get to. And if we can stem some thought that hasn't been done before in your minds or offer you a different take on a subject, then that's a win right off the bat, that your question could be answered or a new one comes up in your mind that might spark an adventure. And Jim's stories and adventures are just, really on par with what I love to hear about a life. So, Jim, what is that beautiful question, man? What are you what drives you in that regard? What's that question that you live your life as an attempt to better understand that?
I live my life for two things: the future, which fascinates me, and people and what I can learn from others.
The future,
Hmm.
and you find that fascinating, and people and how you can learn from others. Now, let's hear that in the form of a question.
Um, I'm going to go back to, why do you get out of bed in the morning?
Love it.
And my answer to that is, I get out of bed in the morning because I want to see what's going to happen. I can see what had happened or has happened. That's something that is, delivered every day to us by our media, through the connections we have with family and friends and colleagues. But I want to see what's brewing and what's percolating for the next month or 3 months, or what may happen in the next year. And it's more than just prognostication, it's a combination of trends, where other people are excited, where there's an opportunity that you can see somebody taking advantage of that others have overlooked. And that to me is thrilling.
Wow. So why do you get out of bed? And then you sandwich it in again with another great question of why, where, not just why, but where are people excited? Like, who is that person that can even come to that space and be excited? And again, thank you for the compliment on the podcast section preceding our stream here, saying that I think about things in systems. I see the same in you, and I really appreciate how you take what some imagine someone in your life or those listening where someone says to you, why are you so sensitive? Where we could reframe that, which is one of my favorite words, and say, why are you so considerate? Why do you feel as though you're so considerate of these things, Jim?
Because the older I got, the less I knew. And the older I got, the more I realized where there are gaps. I remember the Dr. Seuss book, Horton Hatches a Who. And in Whoville, everybody was invisible to Horton, invisible to almost the entire world. And they were able to break through their chant. But the point was, unless you were willing to look and you happened to be there and you were able to drill down to that extent, you might have missed that. So the more you can listen for the chant of Whoville, the more interesting things you're going to learn.
Did you see they released that as a movie recently?
No, I haven't.
It's actually a lot of fun. And my daughter, it's like on a kid's version, which, Seuss just played with that mind and had so much fun in that space. I really appreciate the Horton story of it's like Mother Goose, right? The more you listen, or the wise owl, right? And specifically in Mother Goose, a poem that says just the more you listen, the more you learn.
Mm, which is true.
Okay, so Carnegie once said, he's like, I think he quoted from Ben Franklin's autobiography. A Quaker friend of his took him aside and he says, "You know, Ben, you know more than most, but really at the end of the day, none of your friends can stand you." And really, when you boil it down, and I'm not taking the full quote into account here, he said, "If you continue on this path, you'll know as much as you do now, which is very little." And it was a stern rebuke that sort of set him, he said, on a course that, changed his life. So let's hear about a great origin story or something that you've just kept near and dear to you, the person that said, "Don't ever let your light don't shine," or something along those lines. Jim, what's a great thing that has kept you trucking over the years on these beautiful questions?
The great thing was that I realized that by doing things along the lines of Franklin, what you had just mentioned, it felt good initially. I accomplished this wonderful thing, or I fixed X, or, and I can tell you how to do Y and Z and so forth. But when I was doing that, I was shutting out all the other voices or the other opinions or how other people could contribute to that idea. So I wound up doing the most difficult thing of my entire career at the suggestion of a colleague. And today it's abbreviated as STFU. Um, and for somebody who likes to give advice or opinions, I still have teeth marks in my tongue for the number of times that I've had to keep those letters or that acronym in mind. But it's paid enormous dividends.
Wow, that's incredible. So you're resilient and you take those things in stride and gratefulness and you learn from them. Is that what I'm hearing?
And the more I listen and the more I know, the more excited I am,
Mm,
and the more questions that that raises.
nice.
In essence, I love the idea of the 2-year-old whose answer to every answer is why.
Whose answer to
Is
everything.
why. In other words, if you say this has to be done, and the 2-year-old will say why, well, it has to be done because of this way. Well, why? So that all of the suppositions have to be discussed. And eventually you will come to things that either you don't know or you're positing based on inaccurate or incomplete information. So if I get in touch with my inner 2-year-old, I wind up learning a lot more.
Wow, that's incredible. So the person inside of you or that thing like Carl Jung talked about, the young person in the mirror or the future adult version is what a lot of people talk about. And so if we take things back to that level, there's some people in the past who have talked about, again, I think this is sort of Alan Watts again, where he says when the child gets to the deep philosophical why, right, where the parent can't answer,
Mhm.
what what do a lot of people do? They say, "Oh, well, Johnny, Jim, Sarah, Ellie, go have a donut.
Right.
Go have."
We have reached the limit. And rather than my admitting that we have reached the limit and exploring an answer, it's a lot easier to say, go do something else, or here's a diversion, or, daddy has a headache, or whatever it may happen to be. The difficult part that I find in myself is catching myself when I want to dismiss something. And the corollary to that is as I've gotten older, there is now a constant battle between experience and experience. What haven't I experienced yet? And what have I experienced? And as you age, what you have experienced tends to be easier to think about and pushing away that which you have not experienced yet. And it's almost a dynamic tension between the two. And for instance, one of the cliches about hanging out with older people is that, oh Lord, here come the stories, or their answers are going to be based on something that somebody said in 1977, and so on and so forth. And Part of that experience is very valid and worthwhile. But if you live just in that experience, you're shutting out all of the ideas that can happen from change. And I'm finding that among my friends who are in their late 20s, they're having the same problem with people who are in their late teens because life, technology, access to information, communication style has changed so rapidly in the last decade.
That's interesting. So, this reminds me of some shaman cultures that I breezed over on the tours of ancient literature and other things like that. Just historical records and some active societies where, in Africa, for example, you'll see young girls working with much older women, right? Very much older women. And the reason they do that is they say one is coming out of that experience, right? Coming out of that naivete, that bliss, and those kinds of things, leaving the spirit realm, and then the other one is sort of entering it, right? And so they're a nice pairing because they have the same problems, right? One's ramping, and one's they're different sides of a bell curve at that point in time, or the two mountains, so first mountain and second mountain, or however, whatever metaphor works. It floats your boat, tickles your pickle, whatever the case is. And so, at the end of the day, I'm really really trying to hone in on when you talked about like where are people going to be excited. I think this is a good bridge here because they're going to be excited on relational concepts, where when we talk about this explosion of people coming out into social media, or most of the world coming online to banking or internet, or there's a lot of people out there, regardless of our first world concerns here in the US, that are not able to enjoy this kind of this thing. And that's not something I feel bad about. It's more like, hey, we need to get something out there for that opportunity for them, that to be available for them. So, where are people going to be excited? I want to focus a little bit on that. So when it comes down to, let's say, this young girl and this older woman, why are they excited with each other? Or where are these things happening in society that you're seeing right now, Jim?
Well, in that example, I'd ask the question, are they excited about one another? What are their respective views? And as an example from the United States, which is where my experience is, I see the reactions of older people. In other words, the stories, this is what happened, this is what I know, is almost reflexive and shows fear about where they're going to be in the future. Am I going to be relevant? There was a wonderful line in a Beatles song, which of course dates me, in When I'm 64, and the line was, will you still need me? Will you still feed me? And that is the heart of some of the fear and ossification of older people and how difficult that is. In other words, am I going to be rendered so obsolete that somebody doesn't see value? Somebody who's younger might say, should I even bother talking to this person because I'm going to be dismissed out of hand? What I have to offer may be something that my peers might get, but that person who's two generations removed isn't. The key is not so much the excitement of the two people, it's how do we get a cultural bridge so that on both sides of the age spectrum, people can let their guards down, can let the drawbridge down so they can be vulnerable for that type of share.
That's pretty amazing. So that's a delimiter, and one of the reasons why people would be excited, as long as I have that clear in my mind, for them to come to the table, for them to be even at the where are people excited.
Yes, that's true.
All right. That's really cool. And that's very interesting. So what are some of your, let's call it, tactics for a room where those stories start coming up, and you're working with folks that might say, "Oh, here comes the stories."
My tactics are to look very closely at the room and listen closely to see, is this story going to be relevant? And do the people in this room relate to some of the things within the story? And a lot of it also, Brian, is, do I understand the conversational and communication style of somebody who's two generations removed? What I have learned is that telling a story like that is usually anathema.
Mm.
It's not anathema if I admit my limitations going into it, including if I'm going to bore thee, and I'll expletive or whatever, which tends to work with a crowd in their teens or 20s of people I'm hanging out with, let me know. And if I come to the phrase of I remember, and it's a period of time longer than 3 years, we're in trouble. So it might be a matter of taking a principle that's happening. Another thing that I found is that it is critically important to hang out with different generations. As a person who's interested, and not as a supervisor or sage or anything along those lines. For myself, in the last year, almost all of the new friends I've made are under age 30. And I've also learned that virtually all the cliches that you will read, usually written by people in their 50s and 60s, are almost all wrong. There are different ways of communicating. I had never understood memes and how instantly created memes are supplanting the type of humor that I would have heard, say, on a variety show a million years ago. The pacing is different. The reactions to different events are different. And the hardest part for me was not to say this is wrong or this is right, but this is. And what could I do from the fact that it is? That's what excites me as well. In other words, an analogy I might draw is, I'm now thrown into a math class, but everything is in base 8. So the people who are thinking in base 8, it's very easy. And I have to do some gymnastics to get to that point. But the common language is going to be base 8. Do I say I can't handle this? I'm going back to base 10 and complain about base 8 and why this doesn't matter and the world is organized by X, Y, or Z? Or is there something really interesting in Whoville in base 8?
Hmm. And all it takes is the ability to listen for those gymnastics that you clearly see yourself doing and sort of catch yourself sometimes, or maybe just go for it and then turns out the other person loves Judas Priest as well.
Well, it's more like Tycho in this case. It's more, a friend of mine made a good deal of money making vaporwave cassettes in the last 2 or 3 years. And for me, the idea of a cassette being cool because of its obsolescence was kind of strange. Because I said once, and I started to say, once upon a time, there was this thing called Columbia House, but I really couldn't go there. Um, but that was exciting to me. Wait a minute, here's an ancient technology. It's been repurposed. People like it because of what it was, that it was tactile and it had flaws, and a musical style that's based upon modifications of other music. And the modifications I found are fascinating, which is, going further, a reflection of where we are today. So if somebody were looking at society based on their perceptions of being what they experienced up to age 20 or 22, I can see how those distortions would be very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And that interest is what causes you to put yourself through uncomfortable work where you have to do gymnastics in the attempt to learn to expose yourself. And it sounds like you just have a great time with people on that path of learning.
Um, I'm having a marvelous time. What I also found is that if I don't understand something, or I'm lost, or have some feelings about X, Y, or Z, ask. Urban Dictionary is my friend. YouTube videos are my friend. Um, I have one video series that I love watching that's filled with obscure cultural references to things that happened in the 1990s that I wasn't up on, that somebody who was 18 or 16 would have been, engrossed with. But I, at that point in my 30s, would have been like, I'm losing touch, which, by the way, happens to most people. After about age 30, 31, all of a sudden the new bands are unfamiliar to you and your world starts to sort of ossify, and it doesn't get any better. So when I'm watching videos with discussions of 90s culture, I have a pause button and I have a Google search, and I was describing it to the fellow who produced the videos and told him how much I loved it, because I said essentially it's like going through the annotations in a Shakespearean play.
Mm.
And I said, it's really not that much of a difference to go to Swoons versus a band that broke up in 1997 because the leader had a heroin overdose.
There's a lot of stories out there, and they come and go and fade into this wonderful fabric that, of history and the flow of time that we all exist on. And so it's cool to go back and give some homage to those people, or to be able to better relate to that. Or maybe you're a student of history, or you just really just maybe you're hitting maybe you've learned almost everything and you have to go back through other generations I'm joking about that, but that's really cool that you're interested in that.
And so many things too, Bryant, are based upon happenstance, that things come together for a reason. Okay. And as an example, in the past month, there was a huge tumult in American life, or certainly American political life, and unprecedented things were happening. And it so happened out of the blue that I read an article in an ancient magazine from the late 1950s, written by the superintendent of schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. And this was the famous desegregation issue in 1957, which was the first Southern school that was desegregating based upon the Brown decision from the Supreme Court. But what I found fascinating is, here's the guy who had to implement this. He wasn't terribly thrilled about it. He was no angel. He would prefer the status quo. The community certainly didn't want it. There were politicians who saw that this was a way that they could make hay and improve their chances for reelection and gaining power. But he was compelled to do the right thing as defined by the courts. And he did it. It was unbelievably difficult. There was mammoth backlash following that, and he was fired from his job. So I looked at what was happening today by people who were ordered by the courts to behave in a certain way, and it was their obligation. But it was their obligation, and at some points, it might even be to the cost of their life, possibly. And in the case of the superintendent, he had to have federal troops protecting his family because of the outrage within the community. And I just found it fascinating, by happenstance, of seeing that article, while I'm going to say a vague reflection of similar circumstances was happening at the same time.
Hmm. This is interesting. You you're very, it seems like, in tune with these patterns, and you see these reactions or people being forced to do certain things, and then you see the culture changing and the music and things like that, and it's a reaction to that. You look at the Vietnam War and the music that was coming out of that time, and what was on people's minds. And a reporter once said to me, as her friendly Uber driver for the day, I think I was just saying, all right, I was starting my business, I'm like, hey, I can go from here to there and leave 10 minutes early and pick somebody up, and I'm not paying for my trip, right? That's a great thing. We have a good conversation. It's a nice time. Um, she said, if you ever just want to get the cultural vibe, just go ask a taxi driver. In fact, just have them drop you off somewhere and take two or three taxis. right? And just hey, keep getting picked up and asking people the different questions and that you're interested in. You'll get a good view of what's happening in that city or things like that. So you're like an investigator. That's so cool.
Well, and the antecedent to that, Bryant, was there was a famous cultural audio engineer, and I'm just going to say somebody who was fascinated by culture and sound, named Tony Schwartz. And in the 1950s, when tape recorders first began to come out, and they were fairly bulky, he figured out a way of disguising one in a briefcase. And what he did was what you said. He just took taxis all over New York and recorded the cab drivers, what they were thinking, how they were relating to different events, how they saw the world changing, what were their frustrations. And you're absolutely right. If you listen, you'll get a picture that you probably never would have had otherwise. Extended today, now with an Uber, you get two or three people interacting. And there's a certain etiquette about how that works in an Uber as well, because of the expectations of Uber, because of the expectations of politeness of being in a strange vehicle with strangers. Um, I find that fascinating, and there is a continuum.
That's really interesting. I just looked into Tony Schwartz. It looks like he's most noted for that, for what you're referring to and some innovations. Did you know, it, unless I'm hitting the wrong person, that he wrote The Art of the Deal for
No, that was somebody else. Tony Schwartz's um, most famous creation was the infamous Daisy commercial in the 1964 presidential campaign, where the Democratic Party ran a little girl picking daisy petals and counting down, and then there was an atomic explosion. And in the implication was, if you vote for the Republican, we're going to have nuclear war. It was considered revolutionary and political advertising, and a lot of the gut punch, and I'm going to say grossly overstated or unfair messaging that we think of today, had Tony Schwartz as the antecedent in 1964.
just even looking at this, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is this is pretty powerful. I'm gonna actually bring this up here, which is very out of form for this just generally ever. However, this is really quite fascinating. Would you mind if I bring this up here?
Go right ahead.
Right, cool. So I think we need to share computer sound. So this does this it look like what we're looking for, Jim?
Instagram on the App Store. Hard to navigate, make money on Instagram. I don't think that's the right screen.
Nope, that's the wrong one. Let's switch our share. We've got the little girl and there she is. All right. So we brought up the
There she is. There's the Daisy commercial.
Ah yes, I was trying to figure out how I could use Instagram on my computer earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's check this out.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
And maybe if you want to leave commentary, but offer commentary while we listen to it.
One, two, three, four, five, seven, six, eight, nine,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Whoa! That's
Mm-hmm.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress.
make sure
Mhm.
that
Visit us at loc.gov.
Well, Bryant, that is the ur text of modern political advertising.
Whoa, I literally have goosebumps just everywhere. That is such like because I'm thinking of my daughter. I love how she miscounts like that. It was so
Mhm,
pure and innocent, and we need to preserve this innocence. I'm hearing this like,
mhm,
whoa, that oh man, thank you for sharing that, Jim. Like that is one of the best shares, and I'm glad we just brought that up and experienced that. Like that, oh
mhm.
man, that is the pretext. And you've been watching this and paying attention very consideratively and sensitively to this, and it seems like you can't help but pick up on this stuff.
It's fascinating because you can see again the beginning of the total change in political discourse. One thing that's interesting is that the Democrats were almost certainly going to win by huge margins simply because of where the country was at that point, irrespective of the Republican candidate, Barry Goldwater, who was extraordinarily conservative, and some people thought at the time a little nuts. So this was almost gilding the lily of even running a commercial like this. It was in some ways, I'll just say, politically gratuitous,
Hmm.
but it was um,
Was it a landslide that year?
an enormous landslide.
It
And
sounds like, by the way.
and Martin, the landslide was largely because of grief over Kennedy's assassination.
Ah,
In that Johnson had been Kennedy's vice president, assumed the presidency, and his platform was that I am going to continue JFK's policies. So that in and of itself was really going to drive his victory. But what's fascinating is how Tony Schwartz was able to take those images and those concerns that people would have, a million speeches about, the threats of nuclear war or the ban the bomb movement of the early 1960s or concerns about children. And 1964 was the last year of the baby boom. So she reflects the last wave of the huge social changes in the United States with the explosion of children in the suburbs and so forth. And her future is what drove so many of the cultural changes beginning in the mid 1960s.
wow. How elegant. Just what was that, a minute of our time? One single minute?
And think of how long that is. We have a Super Bowl commercial now that was 5 seconds for Reddit, and everybody was talking about it.
Wow.
Has
Which
it
one are
gone?
you referring to? I did not watch Super Bowl.
Well, this Reddit ran a commercial in the Super Bowl that began with some cliched images of like two cars driving on a road as though it were a car commercial. And for a split second, they had something on the screen saying, we didn't know what to say in 30 seconds. So in five, we're saying this, we're glad you're reading this, and X, Y, and Z. And it ended with something else that was a non sequitur. But that's what got attention now. And you listen to listen to discussions about commercials during the Super Bowl, and that's what was remembered because it was so vastly different from everything else. But when you mention a minute, here's a commercial where no one would have the patience today for her countdown. They would have wanted to go directly to the message, like X is this and they're doing this, or somebody else saying I was ruined by Y or Z and so forth. That setup really is powerful because you and I wanted to take time out. As you mentioned, we're going to break the conversation and take time to look and study this. People still did. We still had long form commercials. We still had long form viewing of shows. A TV series would be kept for 26 weeks. Today, a hit might be 10 weeks. That level of acceleration had begun and it just kept getting shorter and shorter. So now our attention goes to 5 seconds.
That's really interesting. I'd love to get your opinion on this, Jim. Have you ever heard me mention a self-filtering mechanism before? I may or may not have brought it up.
You have not. Please do.
So what if you intentionally left typos, which you will see on our Bluprint website? There are intentional typos left on the website. What do you think that does for us?
Well, it does two things. Number one is it helps you identify people who think typos are important to correct. And it also helps you identify people who are not following the text closely enough to identify typos.
That's very interesting. The second one has not actually been brought up, that people who aren't paying attention to identify the typos. The extension group from that is, and I'll give Y Combinator, Michael, their CEO, the guy who started Twitch TV, he said, build your company, build your idea always for your most desperate customer, right? The person that's in the desert, and if you don't get them their product and service, their company dies, their relationship dies, whatever that case is. And so, yeah, absolutely. And someone who is a desperate customer, they
Mhm.
probably don't care about a typo.
That's interesting. Or I will say at the same time, somebody who didn't take the trouble of a commitment to read the material that would have that same reaction, would not pick up on the typo. And this is hardly an original idea for me. I stole it from David Lee Roth,
Okay.
where when the famous story about the green or yellow M&Ms, where they insisted that they all be pulled from the uh, glass in the green room. The only reason he put that requirement in the contract was so that he could go in and see if they had that color M&M in the jar. And if they did, he would immediately know that they hadn't read the contract, which would mean he'd have to go back and check everything.
Hmm. Leave a, that's really interesting. So let's focus in on a few things you'd like to highlight here, because I've just had an absolutely great time, and we have about 3 minutes left to sort of focus in some of this jazz and talk about those beautiful questions of why do you get out of bed and where are people excited, and we've talked about some of the how and gone back and forth on a few things here. Jim, what are your closing thoughts here today?
My closing thoughts are I want to hear more. I want to see more. And I am concerned and excited about how much I'm allowing myself to hear new things and where the experience is pushing back. The dynamic tension is now part of what's defining my life. And being able to stop, and I'd say to anybody, and say, by doing something or thinking something, have I pulled up a drawbridge so that nothing else can come in? And conversely, if I have to focus on something, sometimes I do have to let other things be held away or in abeyance. But what should that be? And the question constantly changes. And if you don't mind an example, I had my two parents, now deceased, were in nursing facilities for the last few years of their life. And there was a constant question every day that if some problem arose, was it because of their natural decline, or was it because of sloth or incompetence or both of the nursing staff? And every single issue had to be investigated on those two things. And as a child, you don't want to see your parents decay and die. So your initial reaction, certainly my initial reaction, was this must be all of these problems that are caused by this institution. Whereas they were declining based upon nature and based upon their ailments. But sometimes it was the institution's problem that might have been exacerbating something. So it was a constant tension between those two issues.
You talked about it earlier about experience and experience, right?
Yes, right.
Yeah, so I hear you, and we use things to justify. We We do a lot of things, and I love how you do your due diligence. You really look into things. The green M&M thing is really standing out for me. Like if there's green M&Ms, I'm gonna have to go back and check how thorough you are, and do you show up on time to that meeting. For anybody out there, just that one simple goal that you'd like to see, where you can share that with someone else as a boundary and find out how genuinely interested in you they are.
Hmm.
And find out going forward from there, really what kind of jazz you can make. Because just like dating, guys, sometimes you got to slow things down to speed them up, or maybe take a counterintuitive approach. And so I really appreciate this here today, Jim. Where can people get a hold of you? I think they're going to have just an absolutely great time.
They can get a hold of me by email at Jims, Jims, at symbol Elsinore, ElsinoreBA.com. They can call me at my office, which is 610-896-7047. They can go to my website, which is elsinoreBA.com. It has an address if you want to send something by snail mail, or throw a rock at the front window, or send smoke signals, whichever means works best for you.
A nice calligraphy letter, or a nice basket of jams and fresh breads is also accepted, I'm assuming, by Jim.
Absolutely. And my ability to consume said things still remains unimpeded by age or weight.
Well, hey, I'd really appreciate that. And what were your parents' names, by the way?
Joan and Art.
Joan and what?
Arthur for Art.
Joan and Art. Well, thank you. And I can see that they're probably very proud. And I would be. I have my own children now, and I hope we, as a family, and I see the same, or I assume the same in your life, where we'll look forward to affecting those around us to be like the people that we want to be, because there's a lot of validation from the past, great history, pride, those kinds of things. And I love how you look forward into doing the uncomfortable, into those gymnastics, where you but experience again, it's experience, and you put yourself out there where you might not be comfortable, and you might feel out of your place, but you've learned to appreciate that, and filter that for the benefit of not just your family, but the institutions that serve that family as well, as you sort of closed on there. So,
Oh,
Jim,
like if I could add one thing, Bryant, there were some marvelous, marvelous moments with my parents in their decline, and things I learned about them and about myself that I wouldn't have traded for anything. So yes, there was that constant tension, and of course it's awful seeing somebody on the decline. But if you're open to something like that and participating, you can have experiences that you never would have dreamed of. So I got as much out of the relationship of being an advocate for myself as I did as somebody who was helping them.
wow. So you're setting yourself up with the intention to learn, and it's pretty much impossible not to move forward with you as long as people have the motivation and willingness. Is that fair to say?
I think that is.
Wow. Well, Jim, people know where to get a hold of you. These beautiful questions. Why do you get out of bed? Where are people excited? And the relational concepts and the history. I love the Daisy commercial. I'm going to go rewatch that and probably share that with a few people who I know will appreciate that. And there's a lot to take away from that. Everybody out there, you're in a landscape of uncertainty, just like all of us, which truly in life is one of the certain things, that there is uncertainty. And there's a lot of people out there with opinions. There's a lot of people out there with information. Find that real community, align with people on why they get out of bed, would be just our advice. The one thing that we encourage just by doing this episode each week. Moving that forward, find out how they do it, find out that mission statement, those values. And I'm not talking about just, trust, transparency, honesty. I'm like, be authentic and surrender to those outcomes. This is what we're looking for. Set those goals, and do not accept anything less than the reality where you are achieving your goal, where you can walk into any room and get someone excited because Thirdly, you've done the uncomfortable work to get there to become more authentic again. And I see that cycle in your life, Jim, and I really appreciate you, sir. Thank you for coming on to our show today and learning with me.
And thank you for your hospitality. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Oh man, it's my pleasure. So thank you, sir. And thank you, everyone out there. You guys are wonderful. And just remember, there is something inside of each of us, something so, so special. The reason that someone loved you, your mother, your father, that person that's so, so special. And if you could, for me today, just try to think about that in your life to say, and this is to everybody out there, to say, what is that thing inside of me so I can go see that in the lives of others and understand with them how they intend to live their life as a better or as an attempt to understand those questions. Thank you very much for your time, everyone.